Dust Devil and a man already at peace with dying. The Dust Devil came twisting across the barren flats like a restless ghost lifting grit into the noon light until the sky shimmered with a kind of fever dream haze. The Arizona Territory, in the summer of 1882, was a country that could scrape a man down to the bone sun, burning from above earth, cooking from beneath, and wind slicing in from every direction as if it had been honed on a whetstone. Jacob Thorne rode through it without hurry, his back straight, despite the ache stitched into every muscle, his eyes fixed on the vague shape of Bitter Creek somewhere ahead. He was a man who no longer feared death because he had made peace with it long ago. That didn't mean he welcomed it recklessly, but he carried it the way some men carried a favorite pocket knife, always on him, never out of reach and used when the moment called for it. He was broad-shouldered, weather-creased, and looked like someone who had spent too many years listening for trouble and too few listening for laughter. The brim of his hat shaded eyes that had seen cattle wars, blizzards, and the kind of violence that stuck to a man's soul like burrs in wool. His coat was worn, but serviceable, his colt low on his hip, and worn silver at the edges from long use. There were more scars beneath the coat than anyone needed to know about, and none of them were for boasting. Most were work-related, the kind of work where you got paid to make sure someone else didn't walk away breathing. He'd been summoned here by a woman he'd never met in person, though her reputation had written the wind ahead of him for weeks. She was said to be beautiful in a way that winter storms were beautiful, cold, dangerous, and capable of scouring you raw. 25 men had already answered her challenge, and 25 men had been laid out for the buzzards and the sun. Jacob wasn't here for the bounty she offered, though it was enough to tempt a man who had never seen that much gold in one place. He wasn't here for land or a woman's hand. He was here because sometimes life got worn down to a thin edge, and you reached the point where you either quit riding or you pointed your horse toward the worst thing on the horizon and saw what happened next. The desert stretched in all directions, an ocean of heat and silence, broken only by the ragged spines of rock outcroppings. Somewhere out there, maybe beyond the ridgeline, maybe watching him even now, was the thing that had been killing with such precision and ferocity that grown men whispered about it like children telling ghost stories. The Dust Devil spun out and collapsed into nothing, leaving Jacob alone with the hum of the insects and the sound of his mare's steady breathing. He reached down and patted her neck, Ash, a steel-gray mare who had been with him through too many close calls to count. She was as unflappable as he was, maybe more so, and she didn't spook easily. He figured if they both made it through what lay ahead, it would be more her doing than his. For now, he kept his eyes forward, letting the horizon rise and swell in the heat, shimmer, knowing every step was bringing him closer to a place where 25 men had already left their bones. That was fine by him. A man didn't have to be the best shot or the fastest draw to survive in this kind of country. Sometimes he just had to be the one who didn't turn back. 25 deaths and the legend of the beast. Word of the challenge had run like a prairie fire across 3 territories, jumping from saloons to campfires, from mining claims to cattle spreads. It was simple enough to repeat "kill the coyote" and claim your reward. But everyone who'd heard it knew it wasn't just a coyote. The stories that returned from those who'd seen the bodies, or what was left of them, painted something far stranger. At first, people figured it was wolves, maybe a mountain lion with a taste for easy kills. Then the pattern began to show itself, and any man with sense knew they were dealing with something else entirely. The first deaths had been livestock, whole herds vanishing without tracks in the dirt, without a drop of blood left behind. Ranchers had cursed rustlers until they found the remains of 2 men hired to guard the cattle bodies, torn in ways no man could manage, and no ordinary predator would bother with. Then came the travelers, weather-hardened teamsters who knew the trails like they knew their own scars, found days later in such a state that even the coroner's assistant refused to finish the examination. The killings escalated. The creature grew bolder, as if each death taught it something new about how to take the next life. By the time the tally reached 25, the pattern was impossible to ignore. The victims were all men who should have been more than capable of protecting themselves, sharpshooters, trackers, bounty hunters who'd lived long enough to be called lucky. Each of them went out under the same sun Jacob was riding beneath now. None of them came back. The few who tried hunting in pairs or groups didn't last much longer. Bullets disappeared into the dust without slowing whatever they were aimed at. Sometimes there were screams. More often, there was only silence. The legend hardened into something close to fact, a predator that could think like a man, move like a shadow, and kill without leaving a trail. The older folks in the territory muttered about spirits and curses. Younger ones laughed, though they laughed quieter each time another man failed to return. Jacob didn't laugh at all. He'd seen enough of the world to know that whether a thing was born from nature or something older, it could still kill you just the same. He pictured the bones bleaching under the merciless sun, a grim gallery of men who had thought themselves untouchable. If the creature kept count, it must have been pleased with itself by now. Jacob, however, wasn't here to make it 30. He was here to learn what those 25 had missed, even if it killed him in the process. Bitter Creek, the town already dying. When the town finally appeared out of the wavering heat, it looked less like a settlement and more like the ruins of a mouth with too many teeth missing. Weather-beaten buildings leaned into each other as though they could hold themselves up better in groups, but even together they looked one strong wind away from collapse. A film of dust covered everything, the hitching posts, the water troughs, the faded signs above doorways. It clung to faces too, the few that dared show themselves streaking the sweat and dirt into masks that said more about fear than fatigue. The main street was empty, except for a single tumbleweed that rolled across in front of Jacob's mare, before lodging itself against the warped boards of the mercantile. Even the saloon, that usual anchor of any frontier town, stood silent. Its bat-winged doors hung motionless, despite the lazy push of the breeze. Jacob reined in at the edge of town and just sat for a moment, taking in the stillness. This wasn't the usual quiet of a place between payday and Sunday. This was the kind of quiet that settled over a graveyard before the first shovelful of dirt hit the coffin. Every shutter was drawn tight as if daylight itself couldn't be trusted. Somewhere, a dog barked once short and sharp, then fell silent. The wind carried a tang of something sour, not the sharpness of spoiled meat, but the older, deeper scent of fear that had soaked into the boards and the soil over months of waiting for the next death. As Jacob guided Ash into the main street, he felt eyes on him from behind cracks in curtains and slats. The town was watching, measuring the newcomer the same way it had measured the last 25 men who'd ridden through here. He doubted they expected him to last long enough for them to learn his name. In a place like Bitter Creek, hope was a dangerous investment. He kept his face impassive, scanning doorways and alleys. He knew better than to underestimate what fear could do to people. Sometimes it made them hide. Sometimes it made them dangerous in ways a man couldn't predict. Either way, he was in it now. This was a town waiting to die, and Jacob Thorne had just volunteered to be the next man standing between it and the thing already tightening the noose. Meeting Victoria Ashford. The saloon smelled of tobacco smoke that had gone stale, whiskey that had long since lost its bite, and something heavier as desperation left too long in the air. The bat-wing doors creaked as Jacob pushed through spurs ringing against the warped floorboards. 3 men sat at separate tables, each hunched over a glass like it was the last friend they had in the world. No one looked up. No one cared who had just walked in. The bartender, a thick-bellied man with eyes that looked like they'd seen one too many things he wished he could forget, was polishing a glass that was already clean. Jacob stepped up to the bar and dropped a silver dollar onto the scarred wood. The sound was louder than it should have been in the quiet, and for a moment every head in the room tilted just enough to mark him. The bartender poured without asking the whiskey, catching the dull light from the grimy windows. Jacob took a sip, letting the burn spread in his chest. That was when the voice came from the shadowed corner, a woman's voice rough like gravel, but smoothed by something richer beneath. "You're here about the bounty." It wasn't a question. Jacob turned slowly toward the corner. She sat half hidden in shadow, but the posture, the presence told him she didn't need to raise her voice to command attention. Victoria Ashford was dressed in black, the sort of mourning that told you she wasn't done burying people. Her silver hair was pulled back tightly, revealing a face carved by time, grief, and an unshakable will. Her eyes, though cold sharp, the kind that saw through to a man's marrow, pinned him in place. She stood and crossed the room in deliberate steps, each one measured, like she was moving pieces on a chessboard only she could see. Up close, she smelled faintly of lavender water, a trace of civilization in a place that had forgotten it. $5,000 in gold, she said. 800 acres of grazing land with water rights. And my hand, if you want it. The room went still. Even the air seemed to pause. Jacob didn't blink. And if I fail, her lips twitched in something that might have been a smile, but didn't last long enough to be sure. Then you feed the desert, and I find the next man. Her voice was flat, like she was discussing the weather. He studied her face. No fear, no pleading, just cold calculation wrapped in something dangerously close to charm. The terms were generous enough to make most men stupid, but Jacob knew better. There was always more to the story when a deal sounded this good, and he had a feeling that whatever she wasn't telling him was more dangerous than the creature itself. The cold warning. She didn't break eye contact as she went on. 25 men have tried. Cowboys, soldiers, bounty hunters, Apache trackers. Every one of them believed they'd succeed. Every one of them died. Do you think you're any different? Jacob took another sip before answering. Maybe they weren't the right men. Something flickered behind her eyes, quick as heat lightning. And you think you are? I think I'm still here, Jacob said, and that counts for something. Victoria didn't argue. Instead, she turned slightly, her gaze going distant for a moment as if measuring his words against some private ledger. Then she leaned in just enough that he could see the fine lines around her eyes, not from smiling, but from squinting into the sun and staring at danger too long. This isn't about bravery, Mr. Thorne. Bravery gets men killed. This is about understanding what you're up against and surviving it. The moment you think you've got it figured out is the moment it kills you. The bartender had gone still again, his rag frozen against the glass. One of the men at the tables shifted in his chair like he wanted to be anywhere but here. Victoria didn't lower her voice when she added, "If you ride out there half-cocked, you'll die fast. If you ride out thinking you're invincible, you'll die slow. Either way, you die." It was the bluntest kind of honesty, and Jacob found he preferred it to false promises. "I'm not in the habit of dying for nothing," he said. She straightened, stepping back half a pace, and the spell between them loosened just enough for him to breathe again. But her warning still hung in the air like the aftertaste of gunpowder. Jacob's suspicion. The gold. The land. The hand of a woman like Victoria Ashford. It was the sort of offer men would kill for and had in other places for less. But Jacob knew how bounties worked, and this wasn't a bounty in any traditional sense. No one offered that much for the head of an animal, no matter how dangerous. The money made sense only if it was about more than killing a threat. Jacob had spent enough years reading people to know when they were holding something back. Victoria's posture never faltered. Her gaze never wavered, but there was a current under her words, the faintest tremor in the way she measured each sentence. She needed someone to do this, yes, but not because the creature was terrorizing the town. The problem was personal, rooted in something older, deeper. He let the suspicion settle in the back of his mind without showing it on his face. If she thought he was just another man looking for quick money, she might tell him more in her own time. And if she didn't, well, he had ways of finding out. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying a dry rattle of something metallic hitting a post. It was a lonely sound, like a bell tolling in the distance. Jacob thought about the men who had heard that sound before him, about how many of them had thought they were walking into a simple hunt, and how few had walked out. Victoria watched him over the rim of her glass. She was waiting for him to commit to take the job on her terms. He wasn't ready to do that, not yet. First, he needed to know what had sent 25 other men to their deaths, and why in her mind he was supposed to be different. All right, I'll now expand ideas 7 to 9 into 3 600-word segments, keeping the pacing slow burn and building the danger through the history of the failed hunters. The failed hunts. Victoria didn't ease him into the history. She gave it to him like a doctor setting a bone hard and without apology. The first few, she said, went alone. Men with reputations the kind who've survived enough scraps to think they're untouchable. They rode out in the morning with rifles across their saddles and spurs singing. By the time anyone thought to check on them, the only sign they'd been alive was the circle of bones left in the dirt. No tracks in or out, no blood trail to follow, just pieces. Jacob didn't interrupt. He'd learned a long time ago that if you kept quiet, people often told you more than they meant to. The next ones thought they'd be clever. She went on, 3 at a time, then 4, then 5. Each group thought numbers would make the difference. They brought repeating rifles, shotguns, enough ammunition to fight a small war. The men posted themselves on ridges, tried to drive it into crossfire. We heard gunfire that night, not a few shots, but dozens. The sound echoed off the rocks for a good minute. Jacob could see it as she spoke, muzzle flashes in the dark, men shouting over the ring of shots, the smell of cordite hanging in the cold night air. And then she said, her voice flattening nothing. No more shots, no more shouting. Just the wind. He'd heard stories like this before, but never with such a complete absence of the usual details. No tracks, no signs of retreat, no partial survivors to give testimony. It was as if the earth had opened up and swallowed them whole. When we found what was left, she said the rifles were still loaded. Some had fired a handful of rounds, others had jammed with fresh cartridges like they'd been dropped mid-fight. It wasn't just killing, it was interruption. Like the thing didn't care about the fight, it just wanted them gone. Jacob thought about that for a moment, feeling the skin between his shoulders tighten. It was one thing to face a predator that killed because it was hungry. It was another to face something that killed simply because it could. The Apache brothers' death. Victoria's tone shifted slightly when she spoke of the next pair. Running Wolf and Stone Bear, Apache trackers. Brothers. I don't know if you've met men like them, but they could follow a ghost across bare rock. They knew every trail, every waterhole, every hiding place for 100 miles. Jacob had met their kind, the ones who could kneel in the dust, glance at a faint scuff, and tell you what made it when it happened and which way it had gone. Those men were dangerous because they didn't just know the land, they were part of it. They didn't ride out right away, she continued. They spent weeks watching. They mapped the thing's movements, figured out its patterns. They told me they'd found its ground a place where it always circled back to. They thought they had it. That was the first mistake Jacob thought, thinking you had a creature figured out. They left before dawn one morning. Didn't take much with them, just enough for a day's hunt. 3 days later, we found them. She stopped for a moment, looking past him at something only she could see. They were high in the rocks. Not like they'd climbed there, like they'd been carried. Their bodies. She let the words trail off. Jacob filled the silence with the picture her tone painted: 2 grown men hauled up a cliff face left where scavengers couldn't easily reach them. That wasn't predator behavior. That was message sending. You think it did that to frighten you? He asked. I think it wanted us to understand something, she said. That height or ground or distance doesn't matter to it. There's no safe place once it marks you. Captain Morrison's return. Victoria's gaze grew sharper when she reached this part. There was one man who came closer than anyone else. Captain Thomas Morrison, retired cavalry, fought in the Indian Wars. He had experience. He knew how to think like an enemy. He took time to prepare more than the others. He went out alone, but he didn't go blind. Jacob leaned in slightly. And he lasted almost a week. That was longer than most of the others combined. What happened? He came back, she said simply. Jacob waited, but she didn't add to it right away. The pause wasn't for drama. It was the kind of pause people used when they were trying to find words for something they didn't want to relive. It was the middle of the night, she finally continued. 3 days after we'd given him up for dead. I heard hoofbeats in the street, looked out my window, and there he was riding like a man who'd forgotten how to steer. His eyes were wrong. Not just tired, not just afraid. Wrong. He kept talking about green eyes in the dark. Said they watched him wherever he went, that the creature was letting him live. Just to see how long it would take for the fear to eat him alive. Jacob could picture it, the haunted stare, the way a man's shoulders slump when he knows there's no winning. Where is he now? Jacob asked. Boot Hill, she replied. 2 days after he came back, he put a bullet through his own head. Left a note. Said he couldn't stand being watched anymore. The saloon seemed quieter after she said it. Even the bartender had stopped his pointless polishing. Jacob sat back, the pieces shifting in his mind. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just killing men. It was breaking them first, and that meant it didn't just have power, it had intent. The bartender's whispered secret. When Morrison's story was done, the saloon seemed to breathe again, though no one dared speak above a mutter. The whiskey in Jacob's glass was warm now, but he let it sit. His eyes roamed the room, catching the way the other men avoided looking directly at him, the way folks do when they've already counted you among the dead. The bartender, however, lingered nearby, his broad hands drying the same spotless glass. When Jacob met his gaze, the man leaned forward just enough to make the conversation private. You really think you can kill that thing? Jacob didn't answer right away. I think there's more to this than I've been told. The bartender's eyes darted toward the corner where Victoria had been sitting. There is. She's not telling you everything. She never does. What makes you say that? Jacob asked, keeping his tone even. Because I knew her husband. The man said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Good man, mostly. But he wasn't checking fence lines that night. Wasn't alone either. He was meeting someone. Jacob kept his face unreadable. Who? The bartender shook his head. Not sure. But I know it wasn't his wife. Somebody had been sending him messages. Weeks of it. He got twitchy secretive. Then one night he rides out to meet them. That's the last we saw of him alive. Jacob weighed the information. What kind of messages? The man's eyes hardened, then slid away. The kind a man doesn't share with his wife. The kind that get you killed in a place like this. Before Jacob could press further, the bartender straightened and moved to the far end of the bar, his back turned. The conversation was over. But the seed had been planted the night Charles Ashford died. He'd been out on more than a simple errand. And whatever he was doing might tie directly into why 25 other men had followed him into the dirt. Mrs. Henderson's sighting. The boarding house stood narrow between the general store and a shuttered barber shop. Mrs. Henderson answered the door herself, a thin, nervous woman who seemed to flinch every time the wind rattled the shutters. She led Jacob upstairs, each step groaning under the weight of their passage. You're the one going after it, she said, not as a question. That's right. She shook her head. You seem like a decent man. Shame to see you throw your life away. Maybe it won't be for nothing. Her expression changed, not quite to hope, but to something more thoughtful. I've seen it, she said. Once. From the window up here, just after midnight. It was standing in the middle of the street, bold as brass, looking up at the houses like it was choosing which one to visit next. Jacob felt the muscles in his jaw tighten. What did it look like? Not like any animal I've known, she said. It stood on 2 legs sometimes, 4 at others. The body. It shifted, wrong somehow. But the eyes. She shivered, green as bottle glass, sharp enough to cut you in half just looking at you. And it smiled. Not like an animal bares its teeth, like a man who knows something you don't want him to know. Her hands fidgeted against her skirt as she stepped back toward the doorway. You be careful, Mr. Thorne. Guns might not be enough for this one. The decision to see the kill Sight's sleep didn't come easy that night. Jacob lay awake, the boards creaking beneath him as the wind tested the shutters. Somewhere out in the dark, something moved, or maybe it was only his mind working over the scraps of truth he'd been fed. By morning, he had made up his mind. If he was going to understand what he was facing, he needed to see it up close. Not second-hand stories, not whispered warnings. The ground itself would tell him what men's tongues would not. Victoria was already mounted when he found her at the northern edge of town. She had traded mourning black for riding clothes canvas and leather boots made for the saddle and gloves that had seen work. The steel in her eyes was the same as yesterday. "Sleep well?" she asked. "Well enough. I've decided I need to see where it happened. All of it. Every man you can show me." A pause, slight but there. "We can start with the first sight," she said, "but we won't make it to all of them before dark. And you don't want to be out there after dark." They rode out along a trail that wound through stands of juniper and pine, the morning air crisp carrying the scent of sage. The landscape was almost beautiful if you didn't know it had been a graveyard for 24 men. Jacob kept his eyes scanning the ridges and shadows. He'd learned to trust the quiet instincts that told him when he was being watched, and he could feel it now prickling along the back of his neck. Whatever was out there knew they were coming, and he intended to let it know he was coming for it too. Bone circles and symbols burned into stone. The first sight lay in a shallow basin north of town, surrounded by scrub and jagged rock outcroppings. It was the kind of place a drifter might camp far enough from the main trail to be out of sight, close enough to water to make it worth the stop. Jacob swung down from Ash, the air around him unnervingly still. He spotted the circle immediately. White, sun-bleached bones laid with deliberate precision, each piece placed as if by an unseen hand following a pattern. The formation was too neat to be the work of scavengers. The circle's diameter was wider than Jacob was tall, and inside it the ground looked scoured clean. No plant growth, no signs of disturbance except for the bones themselves. Victoria dismounted a few paces away, her boots crunching on the gravel. "This was Pete Hawkins," she said. "A drifter, maybe 30. He'd been here 2 days before it found him." Jacob crouched, running a gloved finger along the curve of a femur. It was polished smooth not by weather, but by something more intentional, as if whatever had killed Hawkins had taken the time to finish the remains. His eyes lifted to the boulder standing sentinel on the western edge of the site. Carved into its face was a symbol unlike anything he had seen before, a twisted tree whose branches reached at unnatural angles, roots plunging into the stone itself. The carving didn't look chiseled. The edges were melted, the rock warped as if it had been burned into shape by heat intense enough to soften granite. "Every site has one," Victoria said quietly. "Different symbol each time, always burned in, always deep enough to last centuries." The Apache who saw them refused to say what they meant. They just rode away and never came back. Jacob stood and moved closer, laying his palm against the carving. The stone was cold, but the grooves seemed to pulse faintly under his touch, like an echo of something long gone or not gone at all. He stepped back, letting the image burn into his own memory. Whatever had done this wasn't just killing for food or sport. It was leaving a mark, a signature as deliberate as any gunslinger carving his name into a saloon table. And in Jacob's experience, marks like that were warnings or invitations. The chilly new message. The second sight was grimmer still, but it was the third that stopped Jacob cold. They reached it near midday, the sun high enough to bleach the world into hard whites and greys. Victoria slowed her horse as they approached her posture, stiffening. It was the place where Charles Ashford had died. The bone circle here was larger than the others, double the size, the pattern more intricate, as though the killer had taken extra care. The symbol carved into the cliff face above seemed to shimmer, even in full daylight, its lines jagged and interlocking like a snare. But Jacob's gaze snagged on something else, a tree 50 feet from the circle. The bark had been clawed away in long, deliberate strokes, and carved into the raw wood were words, each letter ragged, yet unmistakable. She knows what she did. The sap around the letters was still wet. Jacob's instincts told him it had been done within the last day, maybe less. Victoria went pale. That wasn't here before, she said, her voice low and flat. I've been to this place a dozen times. That wasn't here. Jacob approached the tree slowly, scanning the ground for tracks. There were none. The earth was undisturbed, the only change being the words themselves. He ran a finger along one of the cuts. The grooves were deep, but not the work of any blade, he knew. These marks were more like the raking of claws sharp enough to score wood like paper. Whatever had made this wanted Victoria to see it, wanted her to know it had been here after she'd last come. And if the timing matched the spread of news through Bitter Creek, then the message had been carved since Jacob's arrival. It knew about him, and now he suspected it wanted him to know it knew. Charles's communication with the creature. Victoria didn't speak again until they were outside the circle. Even then her voice was subdued in a way Jacob hadn't heard before. Charles wasn't just checking fence lines that night, she said. Jacob studied her face, and he wasn't meeting another woman either. Her eyes cut to him quick and sharp. No, he was meeting it. The creature. He'd been communicating with it. Jacob kept his expression neutral, though the idea tightened something in his gut. How dreams, she said. At first they came once or twice a week. He'd wake up sweating, tell me he'd seen something, heard it speaking to him in a language he didn't know but somehow understood. It told him things about the land, the people in town, about me. She began pacing the edge of the clearing, boots kicking up small puffs of dust. Then the dream started following him into the day. He'd hear whispers when no one was there, see symbols carved into walls that I couldn't see. He became obsessed, said he had to meet it face to face. Jacob frowned. You tried to stop him. Her laugh was short and bitter. Charles was a stubborn man. Once he decided something, wild horses couldn't drag him away. I begged him to leave it alone, to pack up and go somewhere else. He said he had to know the truth. What truth? Victoria's gaze drifted toward the symbol on the cliff. The truth about what happened here before the town was built. The truth about why this place is cursed. The truth about what my family did to deserve this. The words carried weight, the kind that made Jacob feel they were standing on the edge of a much deeper pit than either of them had yet looked into. And from the way the air seemed heavier here, he had the sense that whatever waited in that pit had been listening the whole time. The Blackwood Line and Old Crimes. They rode in silence after that, the wind carrying the smell of juniper and dry rock, until Victoria spoke again, her voice low as if confessing something to the land itself. My maiden name wasn't Ashford, she said. It was Blackwood. Jacob's hands stayed steady on the reins, but he felt the weight behind the name. Even in territories far from here, he'd heard of the Black Woods land barons, cattle kings, and if half the rumors were true, a family that had taken more than they'd ever been given. My grandfather, Elias Blackwood, was one of the first settlers in this region, she continued. He staked his claim here, built the first ranch, planted the roots of what would become Bitter Creek. But he didn't claim empty land. Jacob didn't need her to spell out the rest. He'd seen this pattern before, white settlers pushing into ground that had belonged to others for generations, then writing their own history to make it sound like no one had ever been here. There was a tribe here, she said, a small band of Apache. They considered this land sacred, said the spirits here were older than time, older than the people who came after. They came to this canyon for ceremonies to honor what lived in the rocks and wind. Jacob glanced at her profile. Your grandfather didn't care. No, she said flatly. He wanted the land and he took it. Walking Shadow's summons. She reined in near a ridge, letting her mare pick at the sparse grass as she went on. Most men would have just driven them off. But Elias, he didn't want them coming back. He poisoned their water source. Waited until they returned for their spring ceremony. They always came back in the spring. Then he and the men he'd hired cut them down. She didn't turn to see Jacob's reaction. Her eyes stayed fixed on some far-off point, as though she could see the ghosts of that day walking the ridge line. They killed every man, woman, and child, she said, except one. A young shaman named Walking Shadow. He was maybe 17, wounded but alive. He escaped into the rocks, but before he died of those wounds. Her voice faltered slightly. Before he died, he called something. Jacob shifted in the saddle. Called, she nodded. A ritual. A binding. He summoned something from beyond the veil, a spirit of vengeance. The old stories say it can take any shape, wear any face, but it always remembers the debt it's owed. He bound it to this land and tied it to the Blackwood bloodline. The air felt heavier, as if the sunlight had dimmed a fraction. Jacob had heard tales of such bindings, though most men called them superstition. But superstition didn't carve symbols into stone or leave 25 men dead in bone circles. Walking Shadow named it Nalnish, she said, the shadow that hunts. And then he vanished into the rocks. They never found his body. Why now? They started riding again. The canyon walls drawing closer, the path narrowing until it felt like they were being funneled toward something. You're wondering why it's only hunting now, she said without looking at him. Jacob didn't answer because she was right. There's only one Blackwood left, she said. Me. It's waited 60 years for this, for the last of the bloodline to remain. I think it means to end us with me. Jacob studied her, noting the set of her jaw. This wasn't a woman begging for her life, it was a woman stating a fact. But it's not just about me, she went on. It wants to wipe away everything my family built. The ranch, the town, every person who's profited from what Elias Blackwood did. It won't stop until Bitter Creek is bones and dust. The canyon wind picked up swirling dust into thin spirals that vanished as quickly as they formed. Somewhere up in the rocks, Jacob thought he saw a shadow move against the light. It could have been an animal, or it could have been the thing they were talking about, listening, measuring. Victoria's voice cut through the moment. If you're still willing to take this on after knowing the truth, Mr. Thorne, then maybe you've got a chance where the others didn't. Jacob didn't answer. The truth had clarified one thing for him. This was no simple hunt. This was a reckoning decades in the making, and he had just agreed to walk straight into the center of it. Jacob agrees, and the path to Miguel Santos. By the time they rode back toward Bitter Creek, the sun was climbing toward its brutal peak, the heat lying heavy on the land like a curse of its own. Neither spoke much. The canyon they'd left behind felt like it had closed in behind them, sealing away its bone circles and carved warnings until the next time someone was foolish enough or desperate enough to ride in. When they reached the outskirts of town, Victoria slowed her horse and looked across at Jacob. Well, still interested, Jacob swung down from Ash, his boots thudding into the hard-packed earth. "I've already got one foot in it," he said. "Might as well see it through." Her eyes narrowed slightly, studying him as though she were testing the edges of a blade. "Then you'll need help. There's a man here, Miguel Santos. Half Apache. Knows the old ways better than anyone still breathing. If anyone can prepare you for what you're walking into, it's him." Jacob had heard the name before in passing. Men said Santos had been born with one foot in each world, white man's and Apache, and never fully belonged to either. But they also said he'd survived things that would have buried other men. That made Jacob more interested than wary. "He'll talk to me," Jacob asked. "If I send you," she said. "But understand, he doesn't give anything away for free. Not to me. Not to anyone." Jacob nodded once. "Then point me in his direction." She lifted her chin toward the north end of town, behind the old church. "He keeps a garden there." A garden in soil like this was almost a legend in itself. Jacob filed the detail away and headed down the street, the stairs of Bitter Creek's hidden residence following him from behind shutters and curtains. If they'd been looking for hope, they weren't likely to find it in him. But then hope had never been his business. The 3 sacred items. Miguel Santos was bent over a row of green shoots when Jacob found him, hands deep in the earth. He didn't look up right away, even when Jacob stopped a few paces away. When he did straighten, he wiped the soil from his fingers and studied Jacob in silence. "You're the one going after it," Santos said. "It wasn't a question. That's what they tell me." Santos gestured to a bench beneath the shade of the church wall. "Sit. If you want to hunt something like the Nalnish, you start by listening." Jacob sat. Santos remained standing as shadow, cutting across the packed dirt. "You can't kill it the way you'd kill a man or a wolf," Santos said. "But you can send it back. The old ways can do that if you're willing to pay the price." From inside his shirt, Santos drew a small leather pouch, worn smooth by years of handling. One by one, he laid its contents in Jacob's palm. First, a bundle of sage and sweetgrass, dried and tied with sinew. The smell was sharp clean in a way that felt like it cut straight through the heat. Second, a shard of obsidian black as midnight, edges so fine they could split skin without a whisper. Third, a small bone no bigger than a man's thumb, carved with symbols that seemed to shift when Jacob looked at them too long. "Sage and sweetgrass will keep it out of your head," Santos said. "The obsidian is for your own blood, freely given over your heart, so the spirits know you honor the debt. And the bone." His eyes darkened. "The bone comes from Walking Shadow himself. You'll return it to where he fell. Speak the right words and you release him and the thing he bound here." Jacob weighed the items in his hand. They felt heavier than their size suggested. This wasn't about superstition. This was about rules older than bullets. The price of truth. Jacob passed the items back, but Santos shook his head. "They're yours now. but understand they only work if you're honest. The Nalnish feeds on lies, on guilt, on the shadows men carry in themselves. If you face it with secrets rotting in your soul, it will turn them against you. Jacob leaned back slightly. Everyone has secrets. Then decide which ones you can live with and which ones you can't, Santos said. Because when the time comes, it will show you all of them, and if you flinch, you'll join the others in the dirt. It was the kind of talk most men would brush aside, but Jacob didn't. He had lived long enough to know that the things you carried inside could be more dangerous than anything waiting in the dark. The faces of the dead had followed him before, and not all of them had been enemies. What happens if I pass whatever test it thinks it's giving me? He asked. Santos's expression shifted not to a smile exactly, but to something that carried the faintest spark of approval. Then you might survive long enough to see if the old words still work. But survival is the price you pay for understanding, and understanding is the price you pay for truth. The old man closed Jacob's fingers around the pouch. Keep it close to your heart. You'll need it sooner than you think. Jacob slipped it inside his shirt, feeling its weight settle against his chest. It wasn't much compared to the iron at his hip or the Winchester he kept close, but somehow it felt just as necessary. The nighttime meeting with the Shadow Walker. Evening fell like a slow draw of a curtain, pulling the last of the sun's warmth out of the street. Bitter Creek went silent the way a body goes still when it knows a predator is close. Doors were bolted, windows shuttered. The saloon had emptied hours before its doors swinging gently in the wind, before someone inside latched them tight. Jacob sat on the porch of the boarding house, one boot propped on the railing, the other planted firm on the boards. His Colt was holstered, his rifle leaned against the wall behind him. The leather pouch Santos had given him rested against his heart inside his shirt, its weight a constant reminder that this was not going to be a fight won with lead alone. The air thickened as the last light drained from the horizon. Shadows lengthened until they weren't just darkness. They were shapes in their own right, moving with purpose. When it came, it did not come with a sound. One moment, the street was empty. The next, it was there, standing at the far end. Man-shaped but taller than any man had a right to be. The edges of it blurred like smoke caught in shifting wind. Sometimes it seemed broader, animalistic. Other times it narrowed, taking on a silhouette almost human. The only constant were the eyes green, deep as wet glass, burning with intelligence that cut through the dark like twin lanterns. Its voice came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating in the air, in the wood beneath Jacob's boots, in his bones. Another one comes to die. Jacob kept his seat, his hands loose on the chair arms. Maybe, or maybe not, 25 have fed the earth with their blood. What makes you different? Nothing. Jacob said, and everything depending on how you look at it. The shape shifted as it moved closer, each step like liquid shadow pouring forward. You know why I hunt. You know the debt that must be paid. I know part of it, Jacob said. An old wrong, a call for justice too long unanswered. But I also know innocent people are dying, people who had no part in what happened 60 years ago. The temperature dropped. The hair on Jacob's arms prickled under his shirt. Innocent. There are no innocents here. All benefit from stolen land, from blood spilled in darkness. They are complicit. Then you've become what you hate. Jacob said, a killer without mercy taking life because you cannot, because it's justice. That's not the same thing as righting a wrong. For a moment, the shadow walker stilled the eyes narrowing. The air felt tight, as if the whole street was holding its breath. "I am a justice," it said, but the words lacked the certainty they'd had moments before. Jacob leaned forward slightly. "Your pain and grief wrapped in a form that knows only how to kill. But pain isn't justice, and killing everyone in Bitter Creek won't change what was done. It'll just add more bones to the dust." The eyes burned hotter for a heartbeat, and then without a step taken, the figure was gone. No movement, no fade, just absence. Jacob sat a long while after listening to the empty street, the leather pouch warm against his chest. The encounter hadn't been a fight, but it had been a test, one he wasn't sure he'd passed, but he'd seen something in its hesitation, something human enough to doubt. The shift in the darkness. Jacob didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat by the window of his small room watching the street under a moon that seemed too pale to be trusted. The shadow walker hadn't returned, but the feeling of being watched lingered, a constant presence just beyond the edges of vision. He replayed every moment of the encounter in his mind, the way its voice had filled the air, the flicker in its tone when he'd spoken of justice and vengeance as different things. It hadn't been there to scare him. It had been there to measure him, and that meant it was still deciding whether to kill him outright or let him walk further into its territory. When dawn finally seeped into the sky, it came reluctantly, as though the sun itself wanted no part of what lay ahead. The street below was as empty as it had been the night before. Only the wind moved, carrying with it the smell of sage and dust. Jacob rose and went through the careful ritual of checking his weapons, each movement deliberate. Colt loaded clean. Winchester smooth-action cartridges set aside. Knife sharp enough to shave with. Then he touched the pouch again. Inside was the sage and sweetgrass, the obsidian shard, the carved bone. Each felt heavier now, as if the shadow walker's presence had added weight. He couldn't explain it, but something about the street felt different that morning. The fear in Bitter Creek was still there, thick in the air in the shuttered windows, but it had been joined by something else. Not hope exactly, but a pause, as if the predator circling the town was waiting to see what Jacob Thorne would do next. The encounter hadn't been a victory, but it had shifted the ground. And in hunts like this, even a small shift could mean the difference between living and dying. When he stepped out into the morning light, Ash was already saddled. The air was cool, but the promise of heat pressed in. Somewhere beyond the ridges, the shadow walker waited. And Jacob, for the first time since agreeing to take this job, felt the faintest glimmer of something dangerous, the idea that maybe, just maybe, there was a way to end this without joining the 25 men already claimed by the dust. Riding toward Walking Shadow's final stand. The morning sun had only just cleared the ridgeline when Jacob guided Ash toward the northern trail. The air was crisp enough to make his breath cloud, but there was a weight to it, the kind that told him the heat would come down like a hammer before midday. The boarding house was already shrinking behind him. Bitter Creek crouched small against the horizon, shutters closed tight like a town that wanted to pretend the day wasn't happening. He'd chosen this hour for a reason. Predators, whether born of flesh or summoned from whatever lay beyond, had rhythms. The shadow walker hunted at dusk, killed in the hours between night and morning, and slept if something like it slept in the daylight. That made now the best time to ride into its ground. Victoria was waiting at the edge of town, her black mare standing proud and restless. She was dressed for the ride, leather coat, dust scarf hat pulled low, but there was a stiffness to her posture that hadn't been there before. She watched him approach her eyes, scanning him like she was looking for signs of the man who had met the creature, and returned breathing. "Sleep?" she asked. "Not much," Jacob replied. "Didn't feel like the kind of night for it." She gave a short nod. "It'll be rough country." 2 hours to the place they say Walking Shadow made his stand. They rode side by side into the narrowing trail, the land closing in around them. The juniper thickened, twisted by wind and age into shapes that cast strange shadows over the path. Rocks rose in broken teeth, the ground a patchwork of shale and sand. The wind here carried a different sound, not the open moan of the plains, but a whisper that seemed to thread itself between the stones. They passed no birds, no tracks, not even the sign of a rabbit or snake. The stillness was so complete that the sound of their horses' breathing seemed too loud. Twice Jacob caught movement out of the corner of his eye, high on the ridges, but when he turned his head, there was nothing. "You feel it?" Victoria asked quietly. "Like we've been walking into its eyes for the last mile," Jacob said. She didn't answer, but her hand shifted subtly closer to the butt of the revolver on her hip. The Canyon of Waiting. The trail opened suddenly into a box canyon, its walls climbing sheer and high enough to block most of the morning sun. The light here was thin, filtered, and the air was cooler than it had any right to be. "This is it," Victoria said, reining in. Jacob swung down, boots crunching on the thin crust of sand and stone. The place felt wrong in a way he couldn't put into words, not dangerous in the obvious way, but heavy like a church where something unholy had been prayed over for too long. At the far end of the canyon, he saw it a flat ledge beneath an overhang ringed by a half-collapsed wall of stones. In the center, blackened earth. Scattered bones, not the clean white of sun-bleached remains, but old, weathered and cracked from heat. This is where they say Walking Shadow. Called it Victoria, said, and where he vanished. Jacob stepped into the circle, feeling the temperature drop a few degrees. He knelt, sifting a handful of the darkened soil through his fingers. It smelled faintly of sage and something older, something metallic and sharp. He looked up at the canyon walls. Symbols were cut into the rock at irregular intervals, some half erased by time, others as sharp as if they'd been carved yesterday. They didn't match the ones he'd seen at the kill sites, but they shared the same quality, the sense that they weren't meant to be looked at for long. "This is where it ends," he said. "If it ends," Victoria corrected. Jacob stood and touched the pouch at his chest, feeling the outline of the bone, the obsidian, the dried herbs. He'd carry them into whatever waited here. Overhead, the sky narrowed to a strip of pale blue. Somewhere in the rocks above, a shadow shifted, then stilled. The air pressed closer, and Jacob had the distinct sense that they were no longer alone. The canyon wasn't just a place of history, it was a place of waiting, and whatever was waiting here had been patient for a very, very long time. All right, here's the final stretch, expanded into 3 600-word cinematic segments to cover the confrontation, the ritual, and the aftermath, keeping the tension tight all the way through. 26. The first move. The stillness broke with a sound too low to be the wind. A vibration in the stone under Jacob's boots, like the canyon itself, was taking a slow, deliberate breath. Ash snorted ears, flicking back hooves, shifting against the ground. Victoria's mare stamped once and went rigid, eyes rolling white. Jacob didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the mouth of shadow beneath the overhang. It was deeper than it should have been, darker than any natural shade. Something moved there, and the movement had weight, the way a cloud might drift across the sun, changing the temperature of the whole world. It stepped out with no hurry, no attempt at hiding. The shadow walker came in the shape of a man, though taller, its limbs two long joints bending with a predator's economy. The edges of it shifted in the half-light, sometimes smoke, sometimes fur, sometimes the hint of feathers that vanished as soon as the eye tried to focus on them. The eyes were the same green, cold, intelligent. They locked on Jacob, and for a moment nothing else existed. "You came," the voice said, not aloud, but in his head, in his chest, vibrating through bone and blood. "I came," Jacob answered evenly. "You carry his bone." Jacob's hand went to the pouch. "Walking shadow, you think to free him." The words carried no inflection, but the pressure in the air shifted, tightening like a noose. "I think he's waited long enough," Jacob said. It moved closer, every step without sound, without disturbance to the dust beneath its feet. "If you free him, you free me from his will." "Do you know what I will do?" "Then I know what you've been doing for 60 years, Jacob said, "and I think you're tired of it." For the first time, the shadow walker paused. The air went colder. Somewhere above stones shifted and fell the sound echoing down, like the ticking of a distant clock. The ritual. Jacob didn't wait for it to decide whether to strike. He dropped to one knee, drawing the sage and sweetgrass from the pouch. Flint and steel flared, and the brittle bundle caught with a sharp, clean scent that cut through the damp cold in the canyon. Smoke coiled upward thin at first, then thickening, curling between Jacob and the creature. The shadow walker stopped. The edges of its forms wavered as the smoke touched it. "You dare. I respect," Jacob cut in. He took the obsidian shard and pressed it against the spot over his heart. The cut was clean, almost painless, until the blood welled up hot and steady. It dripped onto the soil, dark against the pale dust. The creature's form shivered as if struck. Jacob took out the carved bone. It seemed warmer than before, the symbols on it moving like water under moonlight. The words Santos had taught him rose to his lips, harsh, strange syllables that felt like they came from somewhere older than the canyon itself. They weren't a command. They were an offering, a recognition. He spoke them slowly, clearly, his voice steady despite the tremor in the ground. The shadow walker's head tilted, the green eyes narrowing. The canyon wind swirled, driving the smoke in spirals around them both. Why the voice pressed into his mind. "Because debts get paid," Jacob said, "but not by killing the wrong people." The creature moved not toward him, but around him, circling like a wolf, gauging a threat. The smoke followed it, curling in lazy shapes that broke and reformed with each step. The aftermath. When the last word left Jacob's mouth, the bone grew hot in his hand, then crumbled into dust that the wind snatched away. The green eyes flared once so bright they hurt to look at. Then the shape that was the shadow walker unraveled. Not all at once, it came apart, like smoke blown through a sieve, fragments scattering into the wind, leaving behind nothing but the faint scent of sage, and something older, something like rain on dry stone. The canyon was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence, not the breathless, coiled stillness from before, but the stillness of something that had finally let go. Victoria hadn't moved from where she sat on her mare, but Jacob saw the change in her face. The hardness was still there, but the eyes were different. "It's done," she asked. "It's gone," Jacob said. She let out a breath she might have been holding for years. "Then so is the debt." Jacob didn't answer. He wasn't sure it was that simple. He felt lighter, yes, but there was always another side to old bargains. Sometimes ending one meant starting another. They rode out of the canyon without speaking, the sun climbing high, now burning away the last traces of shadow on the rocks. Behind them, the place where Walking Shadow had stood for the last time lay quiet, its bones finally at rest. Bitter Creek was still a dying town, but now it had a chance. Whether it would take it was another matter. Jacob didn't plan to stay and find out. He'd done his part. Some debts were his to pay. This one had been someone else's, but for a moment at least it had felt like his own. Eyes in the distance. Bitter Creek looked different when they rode back in. It wasn't livelier, not yet, but the air had shifted, the oppressive weight of dread eased just enough for the townsfolk to notice. Curtains moved where they'd been still for weeks. Doors creaked open just a hair wider than before. A few faces appeared in the street, guarded but curious, like prairie dogs testing the wind after a storm. Victoria dismounted in front of the saloon. She didn't thank him, that wasn't her way, but her nod carried more weight than most men's speeches. "The ranch is yours if you want it," she said. Jacob swung down from Ash, adjusted his hat. "I'm not the settling kind," he said. "You keep it. Build something worth the trouble it took to hold on to it." Her mouth tightened, but there was something in her eyes, not gratitude exactly, but respect. She turned away, already stepping back into the life she'd fought to keep. Jacob headed for the edge of town, dust curling up from Ash's hooves. He didn't look back until Bitter Creek was a smudge against the horizon. That was when he saw it just for an instant on the far ridge to the west. A shadow, man-shaped, standing utterly still against the dying light. Too far for detail, but close enough that the hair on Jacob's neck rose. The wind shifted, carrying the faintest whiff of sage. He stared for a heartbeat longer, but when he blinked, the ridge was empty. The land stretched bare to the sky, the only movement the shimmer of heat. Jacob breathed out, slowly turned Ash toward the open trail. If it had been nothing, he wouldn't lose sleep. And if it had been something, well, some debts took more than one lifetime to collect. The sun dipped lower, stretching his shadow long across the sand. Somewhere out there beyond the ridges and the miles, eyes might still be watching. And Jacob Thorne, for better or worse, was the kind of man who never rode too far from his own shadow.